I am absolutely over the moon that I finally get to share the debut of my Legions Imperialis board in video form. This has been by far the biggest ever hobby project I have taken on. The moment Legions Imperialis was announced, my mind started racing, and I knew I had to make the absolute best board I possibly could. The only problem was, I had never built my own gaming board before, let alone the one I had envisioned in my mind. For context, I wanted to build my own epic scale gaming board ever since I discovered Epic back in 1994 when I was 9 years old. But obviously 9-year-old me living in a council flat with my mum in New Addington was not going to be the time or place for a 6-foot by 4-foot gaming table for tiny plastic spacemen. With no guidance or help, I basically gave up on the idea. Yet, fast forward 29 years to November of 2023, and the process seemed to finally begin. Due to the different hats I wear as a music producer, commissioned painter, a sporadic YouTuber, and a wrangler of 2 toddler boys running around the bunker, the project was not actually finished until late of July 2024. Hopefully this gives you some idea of how serious this undertaking was. But it was a challenge I felt very excited by, despite all the wonderful interruptions and distractions along the way. The one giant saving grace was that all the jobs I do, more often than not, require me to be working from home, so I was able to tap in and out of the board project whenever there was a free moment with some degree of ease. Now, with all that being said, I still knew that the most important thing to me was going to be immersion. Now, I've had a few complaints about the grid layout due to it basically being a very easy method of doing shooting galleries, but I didn't care about gaming mechanics. I wanted to sell an environment first. I can deal with the gaming mechanics at a later point, but if things didn't feel and look authentic, the whole thing just seemed pointless to me. And after giving it a lot of thought, I obviously needed to make some sort of game plan. Like, what does a game board like this require? Well, in my case, it required a lot of buildings. And buildings require materials, so how was this build going to come together logistically? These were questions I still hadn't fully figured out how to answer at this point. What I did know was the city will be set in a 30k universe at the dawn of the Horus Heresy, and would be a vertical slice of a city in the country of Albion. And of course, Albion is a fictional country in the fictional planet of Terra. Therefore, I didn't want everything to be ruined yet, because I can always add ruins at a later point. And thankfully, Legions Imperialis even has rules for destructible terrain. But I wanted the initial board to look like a city and feel like a city that was lived in and untouched by war yet. Once again, this was all about the immersion. Alright then, a ton of plastic buildings and other knickknacks should be easy enough to throw on a game board, right? Well, yes and no. Before I could go down the rabbit hole of building and the like, I needed the buildings to be sitting on something, and in this case, I wanted to make some kind of modular tile system. In one of my previous videos, I show the process I went through to make my custom tiles, which you can find a link for in this video's description. Now, to be fair, this was quite a convoluted process that I wouldn't recommend or expect many folks to put themselves through. But it was the best option I could think of at the time that didn't involve a ton of printing resin or miles of PLA. And it forced me to learn some new skills like mold making and working with slow cure pourable tabletop resin. Process I hope I never put myself through again. It was a long, smelly process, but the tiles did what I needed them to do, and what I needed them to do was be a template. For now, the template needed to be simple. I have had a few complaints about the simplicity of the grid system, as I mentioned earlier, but in my mind I had to keep the layout simple as to not overwhelm myself with the layout and all of the buildings that I had to make. I thought if I at least kept the grid layout as simple as possible, I could then make the building situation super intense instead. With the tile setup finished, I allowed myself to move on to the buildings. I started the process by making molds of the Games Workshop Civitas Imperialis set, because I had been looking for an excuse to start learning how to make molds that were even more complex than the floor tiles I'd made, which in hindsight were pretty rudimentary. Of course, I will not be going into the process of how I made these molds for legal reasons, but I will say that this mold making process is exceedingly time consuming, and it's only worth doing if you intend on making a huge amount of buildings. Even then, you still have to consider the molds breaking down due to how heavily they will be used. You see, there are so many repetitive parts, and honestly, it would have made no sense for me doing this if it was not for the fact that I knew I wanted big buildings with very specific considerations. Buying multiple Civitas Imperialis sets could have been done, but it would have left me with a ton of unused parts, which would have been very wasteful and also prohibitively expensive. The board making process was happening during that weird time before Legions Imperialis had rebranded the Adeptus Titanicus Civitas Imperialis terrain sets. There was a shortage of these sets, and sometimes they were going from between $80 to $100 a pop. Really not many buildings are going to be coming in that set either for what I needed. And for that amount of money, I could just buy enough resin to recast about 10 of the Civitas Imperialis box sets. But the time sink is real. Making a mold is pretty simple, but the resin mixing, curing, and assembly can be an absolute nightmare. You no longer have the luxury of experiencing plastic glue and have to superglue or even hot glue every panel together due to working with resin. And of course, speaking of resin, you also have to deal with sanding parts down and the dangers of the fumes and dust that you really don't want to be inhaling, which are always lovely attributes that come with working with resin. And to my shock and dismay, I was going to bed every night with inflamed sinuses brought on by the vapors and dust, in spite of wearing a professional N95 mask during the entire process. Not fun whatsoever, and that was before I even got to the resin 3D printing side of things. Making this board probably took about 5 years off my life, but I was a smoker for 15 years, so I doubt it's going to really make too much of a difference at this point. And so I decided to lighten my load ever so slightly at the halfway mark of the building process by 3D printing in parallel with the recasting process. Thankfully, I found some amazing 3D models that worked exceptionally well with the original Civitas Imperialis terrain kits. Everything was printed in resin instead of filament because I just love printing in resin. Not a big fan of filament printed buildings, especially at this scale, due to the prevalence of striations. Dry brushing really makes those striations pop, and a lot of details will be lost, especially when you're using filaments. The board has a mix of prints from multiple designers, and if you'd like more details on these matters, you can head over to my Bunker6 Instagram account to find more of their work on my page. A link to my Instagram will be in the description of this video. In addition to the 3D printed buildings, I made molds of the spires set too, for I was going to need a lot of spires and columns to put on top of all the buildings I was producing. And I should probably do my due diligence at this point and mention that all of the molds that were made with original kits that I had purchased, and I of course will not be selling my molds or any of the produce that comes from those molds. They are always and only being used for personal use. And actually, now I've finished the board, I've put them all in a box because I never want to look at them again. But if you want to learn the mold making process, there are some very good videos out there. I'm not going to mention any of them here, not because I don't want to promote people, but I don't want to bring them any unnecessary heat to their channels that they may not want. I know how some people can get a little bit spicy about recasting, no names mentioned. So anyway, simply put, the building process took a very similar structure to how I deal with most of my creative problems that I face in my music job. Start broad and then get small. In the case of this board, I worked on the largest parts first and moved along the process getting to smaller and smaller parts. This kept me organized and stopped me working on too many different things at once. 3D printing can get very addictive, so some level of self-restraint is required. Otherwise, you can end up with a ton of great stuff, but not always with much of a use case for it by the end of the project. So getting back to the plan of the board, I had in my mind 3 specific distinct districts that I wanted to use, and I was going to basically set them up as vague rows on the board. This is where the simplicity of the board layout really comes into play. These rows wouldn't necessarily be obvious to an outsider, they would help me keep things organized in my head. The structure in my head was similar to that of how a song is structured, with intros, verses, and choruses. The vertical workflow was going from big to small, and the horizontal workflow was visualizing each district as a plausible locale. The districts I visualized consisted of a defensive district, an administrative district, and an energy production district. It's previously mentioned, although these districts were not super clear, they were at least, to me, a great mental sketch. One thing to mention, the table in my mind was set up as a landscape rather than portrait orientation, so I was looking at everything in that respect as if two players were playing along the lengths rather than the widths of the board. The defensive district would be populated with larger defenses closest to the wall on one side. The administrative district would be at the center of the table, while the energy production district would be at the other end of the table, farthest from the wall. The walled section of the board was spread across the width of one side of the table to give the board a sense of place and imply that the player was playing in the interior of a city rather than a random location with no boundaries. The wall also acts as a way of tempting the observer to imagining what sort of world exists beyond the wall. And talking of walls, the walls inside my studio were originally white, and I felt that that would have broken immersion, so I decided that I'd paint the walls a very, very dark grey to help place the gaming board in a bit of a darker environment. And when you're looking out over the walls, all you see is the dark night sky, which I felt was a bit more fitting to the scene. Initially, the board was set up on a bed in a spare bedroom in my house, but I realized that after some time, playing on a board on a spare bed was not only going to be very uncomfortable due to the low height of the bed, but also inconvenient for anyone who may like to stay at my house over the holidays. So I took it upon myself to build a desk specifically for the game board and move the entire project into my studio, where I make the Bunker 6 videos and do my music production work. This allowed me to get really focused during the painting process because I had the board right in front of me and I could see my progress in real time, or lack thereof. I also produced a few painting tutorial videos for the Bunker 6 channel that showed how I was going to paint a majority of the things on the game board, from the Adeptus Titanicus ground asset sets to the Civitas Imperialis and Spire sets. But I also made the videos as a way to hold myself to finishing the desk. I like doing things like this, where I make public statements of intent and then hold myself to them. As long as it's a reasonable goal, I can generally reach it if I chip away slowly enough. With the painting tutorials wrapped, I also had a useful resource for painting methods that I could look back on and reference in case I took a break and needed to remember and have a refresher on the painting processes I went through for these board assets. The key to wrapping the painting process was going to be batch painting. So to save any back and forth, I had to have a majority of the buildings built prior to painting. I did not want to be tearing myself between painting and still having to create resin casts. I was able to print in parallel to the paint process though, as the 3D printed elements were super easy to assemble, and I was not going to be painting everything at once. If you're struggling to build interesting or compelling buildings from scratch, you can just do what I did perhaps, which was look on Pinterest for previous Adeptus Titanicus builds. This was a huge help and took a lot of risk out of the build process for me. I needed to know exactly what I was going to make before the resin hit the mold. So I would find pictures of buildings I liked, then count the tiles I would have needed to build the exact building I was looking at, or I'd have to adjust the final calculation if additional wall tiles or less wall tiles were required once I made any modifications to the original design. In some cases, I needed to make multiple duplicates of molds because some of those wall panels were so repetitive, I might as well have just had multiple molds of the same piece going at the same time. The one thing that I was totally unable to make good casts of was the Manufactorum set. I've always struggled to get good casts from very small parts. It generally requires a pressure pot, preferably a heated one, and a very well thought out mold. You have to always consider that any injection molded parts are not designed with you wanting to make resin casts of them in mind. So there are a lot of hoops you're going to have to jump through to make functional molds of parts that were not designed for such a process. Now here's the thing, I do own a pressure pot and a degassing chamber, but the work required just didn't make the time spent worth it, and the failure rate was very high for me. Is it possible? Absolutely, but at a certain point you may just want to do what I did, which will probably please GW to hear, which is me picking up a couple of original Manufactorum sets and putting them on the board instead of recasting anything. The parts were going to be peppered around the board, so I did not need a vast amount of Manufactorum parts anyway. They were one of the final stages to be added to the board, the icing on the donut of this gaming board as it were, but the sprinkles would be the trees, footbridges and road islands, which were the absolute last things that had to go on the board. The footbridges do not currently serve any function, but I always envisioned footbridges on the board, and because GW never designed any for this scale, I found myself scouring through Cults 3D for some 28mm versions to scale down to fit into the places where I wanted them to go. The The scale was calculated by measuring the distance with which I needed a footbridge between two buildings, and then converted that measurement into the slicing software. How, you may ask, did I do that? Well, none of this is an exact science. The slicing software I use is the Anycubic slicing software, which suits me just fine. Yes, I know about Lychee and Chitubox, but I've recently had compatibility issues with the latter in recent months. So OEM software it was. In the Anycubic slicing software, there is a grid on the plate, and I learned in a random forum that each square of the grid represented 1 centimeter squared in real life. So with that in mind, I scaled my models accordingly to fit the centimeter gap I was trying to fill. The fact that bridge models were 28mm was great because there was a lot of detail that I was able to squeeze down into these much smaller scale models. Now obviously my buildings were not always going to be whole number centimeter exact distances between each other, but it wasn't too much of an issue. I would generally just guesstimate onto the grid and hope for the best, and if a print came out too big or too small, I would just try again at a different scale. Now, anything else that needs to be scaled correctly to the 8mm scale from a 28mm scale model needs to be reduced to roughly 27 or 29%. The percent is very important. If you're not doing things by percentages, my 27 to 29 number is basically useless. As previously mentioned, this is not an exact science, so doing test prints is definitely advisable. Make sure you have a model that you can compare things to, and generally you can do it by eye. Now, if you're new here and you don't know what I'm talking about with all the millimeter scale things, 8mm is the presumed scale of Adeptus Titanicus, Aeronautica Imperialis, and Legions Imperialis. I'm sure many of you know this already, but in case you don't, Epic and the Space Marine games from way back in the day, which is stuff I also talk about, were actually around the 6mm scale. But some models completely didn't fit that scale and others completely did. It is a whole rabbit hole when it comes to scale before our current editions of tiny Space Marine models and stuff like that. And it's beyond the scope of this video, but on the whole, 6mm for the old stuff and 8mm for the new stuff. And 28mm is for the regular size models from Warhammer 40k over to Age of Sigmar. In order to make things as natural as possible between the original GW sculpts and the 3D printed models that I was pulling in, I tried as much as possible to physically blend the sculpts together, not in a STL sense, but literally just making sure that I was incorporating buildings from the GW sets very closely with the 3D models that I was finding elsewhere. A good example of this is where I've actually combined some custom 3D model road islands with some Forgeworld Adeptus Titanicus barricades. To my mind, this helps make things feel way more cohesive, rather than a hodgepodge of assets clumped together in any which way on the board. Once again, it's all about the immersion. And away from the board, I also upgraded my lighting situation to give the studio and the board itself a nice clean look. And I set up an aerial camera with convenient monitoring for the battle reports. If I could surround the table with a blacked out room, then that would be ideal for wide shots. I'll be the first to admit that this is not the most perfect setup, but I will have to do this for now until my circumstances change. By the time the last Rhode Island was painted and laid on the board, the project was finally done. Well, the building and painting part. I now have to start painting the armies, of course, that will duke it out on the exceptionally clean streets of Albion. Ideally, I will also make the ruin alternatives for each building too, but I currently need a break from building and painting any more terrain. As can so often happen at the start of any creative endeavor, I needed to start painting a picture in my head, a grimdark mood board filled with destroyed architecture and stoic, immovable fortresses, if you will. So I began gathering lots of visual inspiration from all around the internet. There were many great projects that I discovered along the way, from epic cathedral complexes to intricate industrial buildings where the Manufactorum and Civitas sets had been beautifully kit-bashed together. The only problem was that very few of these things I found online were boards in totality, but instead individual unpainted buildings. Of course, many false positives from regular 40k boards. But there was one board, one very specific board that stopped me in my tracks. A board like no other that inspired me to such a great extent that I had no choice but to know everything about it. The board I speak of was created by an artist under the name Sensei Swag. Sensei Swag was a force to be reckoned with within the hobby scene. A painter of vast imperial armies and Forgeworld titans. Numbers of these are crazy. This guy could paint like an absolute machine. Despite the quantity of his projects, the quality would still shine through somehow. It seemed as if Sensei Swag had discovered more hours in the day than the rest of us. Sensei Swag's board was an Adeptus Titanicus board, and it was truly amazing. It wasn't Legions Imperialis because it was made quite some time ago. There were vast buildings much larger than anything else I'd seen online. The GW kits were being pushed to their absolute limit, but somehow it worked. It made the Titans feel small, but that was a good thing, because if you've ever seen a Hive city or a Spire city, you'll know its volume and verticality is something that is very rarely well portrayed in the hobby, if at all. You'd have to go to Warhammer World to even begin to get close to witnessing the true scale of the 40k universe. I ended up messaging Sensei at one point to offer my compliments and also to find out how they painted the roads on this project, because I wanted to potentially incorporate that recipe on my own roads. Sensei was polite and gracious enough to tell me his method, which was a great help. The Sensei Swag board was my absolute North Star and target to be reached. If I could get my board to be even half as good as Sensei Swag's, then I would be over the moon. There were sacrifices I had to make that would immediately make my board less good than Sensei Swag's, that basically being because I had to incorporate some level of modularity to my board because I need to use the table for other games such as Adeptus Titanicus and Epic 40k. But aside from that, I was going to try and get as close as possible to the quality and standard that Sensei Swag's board had offered to the world. But it goes without saying, a project like this isn't always going to be smooth sailing. For I now have to admit that about 2/3 of the way through the project, I started getting quite burned out. I was dreading all the work I had left to do, and there really seemed like no end in sight. So I went back to the Sensei Swag Facebook group to look at the high-resolution images of the board for a bit more motivation, as I have done periodically throughout the project. And it was then when I noticed a long message I had not seen before at the top of the Facebook page. I started to read the post and my stomach dropped, for what I did not realize at the time when I was asking Sensei Swag about road recipes was that would be the last time I would ever be able to speak to Sensei Swag, or as I should probably say, Viet. And I was really looking forward to one day showing him my board if I ever finished it. But that day would never come, for since the last conversation I had had with him, he tragically passed away in a car accident. I was speechless. I had spent months with this man's creations in my head, wondering throughout the days how he achieved certain things on the board and feeling so underprepared with such quality staring back at me. I still don't really know what to say as I write this script. I'm not smart enough to say anything particularly profound, but Viet inspired someone thousands of miles away that he had never met before and turns out never would, and it was then that once I learned of this awful situation, I knew I had to push through. Despite Warhammer being grim and very dark, it's times like this where I realize that relatively speaking, away from the tabletop, things can be just as grim and dark in their own cruel way. But in this moment, for me at least, life made a bit more sense. Viet's creations made an impact elsewhere in a way that he could never have possibly known. Not just to me, but to many people across the world, I am sure. And to me, Viet was living life in its purest form, as someone carving out their path as an artisan, which is never an easy feat to achieve. But in spite of the sadness of the situation, I found comfort in knowing his creative energy lives on in the glass cabinets and on the game tables around the world where his work is being protected and enjoyed by the clients who commissioned his expertise. Every one of Viet's brushstrokes lives on, and every picture a potential new spark of inspiration for anyone lucky enough to see his work. May you rest in peace, Viet. Thank you for your dedication that you gave to your craft. I hope you can see what you helped make happen with the completion of my gaming board. For at this level, it is no longer just toy soldiers, but a young man's life's work. This one is for you, dude. Finally, I'd like to thank my wife for her never-ending support of my creative ventures and the 3D artists that helped get this project over the finish line in ways I didn't think possible when I first started out on this project.